Welcome to this lesson where I'll be introducing AWS Organizations. AWS Organizations is a product which allows larger businesses to manage multiple AWS accounts in a cost-effective way with little to no management overhead. Organizations is a product which has evolved a lot over the past few years, and it's worthwhile stepping through that evolution to help you understand all of the different features. Now we've got a lot to cover, so let's jump in and get started. Without AWS Organizations, many large businesses would face a situation where they need to manage many AWS accounts. Now there are 4 on screen in this example, but I've worked with some larger enterprises with hundreds of accounts and heard of ones with even more. Without AWS Organizations, these accounts would each have their own pool of IAM users as well as separate payment methods, and beyond 5 to 10 accounts this becomes unwieldy very quickly. AWS Organizations is a simple product to understand. First, you take a single AWS account, which I'll refer to as a standard AWS account from now on. So a standard AWS account is an AWS account which is not within an organization. So with this standard AWS account, you create an AWS organization, and it's important that you understand the organization isn't created in this account, you're just using the account to create the organization. This standard AWS account that you created the organization with then becomes the management account for the organization. Now the management account used to be called the master account, so if you hear either of these terms, so management account or master account, just know that it means the same thing. Now this is a key point to understand with regards to AWS Organizations, because the management account is special for 2 reasons, and I'll explain both of those in this lesson. For now, I'll add a crown to this account to indicate that it's the management account and help you distinguish between it and any other AWS accounts. Now using this management account, you can invite other existing standard AWS accounts into the organization. Because these are existing accounts, they'll need to approve the invites to join the organization, and assuming they do, those standard accounts will then become part of that AWS organization. When standard AWS accounts join an AWS organization, then they change from being standard accounts to being member accounts of that organization. Organizations have one and only one management or master account, and then they have 0 or more member accounts. You can create a structure of AWS accounts within an organization, and this is useful if you have lots of accounts and you need to group them by things such as business units, function, or even development stage of an application. Now the structure within AWS Organizations is hierarchical, so it's an inverted tree. At the top of this tree is the root container of the organization. Now this is just a container for AWS accounts which exists at the top of this organizational structure. Don't confuse this with the account root user, which is the admin user of an AWS account. This root, so the organizational root, is just a container within an AWS organization which can contain AWS accounts, and this means member accounts or the management account. As well as containing accounts, the organizational root can also contain other containers, and these are known as organizational units or OUs. And these organizational units can contain AWS accounts, so member accounts or the management account, or they can contain other organizational units. So you can build a complex nested AWS account structure within organizations. You have the root container at the top and then potentially multiple levels of organizational units. Now again, please don't confuse the organizational root that we're talking about now with the AWS account root user. The AWS account root user is something specific to every AWS account that you create. It's something which you can log into and have full permissions over that specific AWS account. The root of an AWS organization is just a container for AWS accounts and organizational units. So the organizational root is just the top of this tree within AWS organizations. It's the top level of this hierarchical structure which allows you to manage AWS accounts within organizations. One important feature of AWS organizations which you need to be aware of is consolidated billing. With the example that's on screen now, there are 4 AWS accounts, each with their own billing information. Now, because these have been added to an AWS organization, this changes. The individual billing methods are removed for the member accounts within the organization. The member accounts instead pass their billing through to the management account of the organization. Now, you might see this referred to in the context of consolidated billing as the payer account, and the payer account is just the AWS account that contains the payment method for the organization. So at this point, if you see master account, management account, or payer account, know that within an AWS organization, they all refer to the same thing: the account that was used to create the organization and the account that contains the payment method for all of the accounts within the AWS organization. Now, using consolidated billing within an AWS organization means that you get a single monthly bill which is contained within the management account, and this single monthly bill covers the management account and all of the member accounts of the organization. So one bill contains all of the billable usage of all of the accounts within the AWS organization. For larger businesses, this removes a significant amount of financial admin overhead. This alone would be worth creating an organization for most larger enterprises, but it gets better. With AWS, certain services get cheaper the more usage you have, and for certain services you can pay in advance in exchange for cheaper rates. When using organizations, these benefits are pooled, and so the organization can benefit as a whole for the spending of each of the AWS accounts within the organization. AWS organizations also feature a service called Service Control Policies, or SCPs, and this lets you actually restrict what AWS accounts within the organization can do. Now, these are important, and so I'm going to be covering them in their own dedicated lesson, which is coming up soon, but I wanted to mention it at this point as a feature of AWS organizations. Now, before we go through a demo where we're going to be creating an AWS organization and creating the final account structure which we'll be using throughout this course, I wanted to cover 2 other concepts of organizations. As well as being able to invite existing accounts into an organization, you can also create new accounts directly within it. All you need is a valid, unique email address for this new account which you want to create within the organization, and AWS will handle the rest. Adding accounts in this way, so creating them directly within the organization, means that there isn't an invite process. Remember, for existing accounts, you need to invite them, and then that account needs to accept it. If you create accounts directly within the organization, then this is a single step. You just create the account in the organization. Now, using an AWS organization changes what is best practice in terms of user logins and permissions. With organizations, you don't need to have IAM users inside every single AWS account. Instead, IAM roles can be used to allow IAM users to access other AWS accounts, and we're going to implement this in the following demo lesson. So best practice is that you have a single account which is used to log into, and I've shown this on this diagram as the management account of the organization. Now, larger enterprises will often keep the management account of the organization clean and have a separate account dedicated to handle logins. Both of these are fine, but just be aware that the architectural pattern is to have a single AWS account which contains all of the identities which are logged into. Larger enterprises might also have their own existing identity system, and they might want to use those existing identities and use Identity Federation to access this single identity account. So you can either have your own internal AWS identities using IAM, or you can configure AWS to allow Identity Federation so your on-premises identities can be used to access this designated login account. From then, we can use this account with these identities and use a feature called role switch, and we can role switch from this account into other member accounts of the organization. And behind the scenes, this actually assumes roles in these other AWS accounts, and this can be done from the console UI, and so a lot of the technical aspects are hidden, but I want you to know how this works. So essentially, you either log in directly to this login account or you use Identity Federation. Then once we logged into this account, we can role switch into the other accounts within the organization, and this is actually a way that the user interface presents assuming a role within the other account. So essentially, you either log in directly to this login account using IAM identities, or you use Identity Federation to gain access to this particular login account, and then you role switch from this login account into other accounts within the organization, and behind the scenes, this is essentially assuming a role which is inside these other AWS accounts, and this is how you effectively manage identities using AWS Organizations. Now, I'll be talking about this in depth as we move through the course, and the next lesson is a demo where you're going to implement this yourself and create the final AWS account structure you'll be using for the remainder of the course. Okay, so at this point it's time for a demo, and as I just mentioned, you're going to be creating the account structure you'll be using for the remainder of the course. At the start of the course, I demoed the process of creating AWS accounts. You created some AWS accounts you'll be using for the course. You should have created a general AWS account and a production AWS account. In the next lesson, I'm going to be stepping you through how to create an AWS organization using this general account. So we'll be creating the organization, and this general account will become the management account for the AWS organization. Then you're going to invite the existing production account into the organization, and this will become a member account of the organization. And then finally, you're going to create a brand new account within the organization, which is going to be the development account. Now, I can't wait. It's going to be fun, and it's going to be really useful for the exam. So go ahead and finish this video, and when you're ready, I look forward to you joining me in the next lesson, which is going to be a demo.